Michael, welcome to Q.
Oh, thank you very much, Tom.
The role of a lifetime, does it feel that way to you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sitting Bull, of course, is arguably the most famous indigenous leader in the world.
Right.
And, I've had a long career in media, 27 years. And, I've had a chance to play, icons, Wandering Spirit, Cree leader. I played Crazy Horse, Lakota leader, Tecumseh. But Sitting Bull is unique, absolutely.
Does that come with some added pressure then to get it right?
Yeah, a ton.
Yeah.
A ton of pressure.
So how do you deal with that?
Well, I always approach. I'm an outsider, of course, to Lakota culture. I'm Nehiyaw, I'm Cree, so I come in with a huge sense of obligation to know, to mine deeply. What are the stories? What's the history? If there's language, how much work can I put into the language? And I was fortunate that Stephen Knight's script was extraordinary. It's landmark in the sense of how broad and expansive portrayal of a Native person is. Usually, we are foils. We play a smaller part inside films, and we're a foil against which the so-called dominant culture asks questions or tries to figure out in terms of us, in relation to us. But in this, Sitting Bull is a three-dimensional person. He's human. He's funny. We see regret, and so as an actor, it afforded me extraordinary opportunities.
The humanity and how funny he is and how vulnerable he is something that really comes out because, as you mentioned, Sitting Bull, one of the most important Indigenous leaders of all time, and such a part of history, and he's someone you see, photos of and paintings of, and you learn about. Tell me a little bit about bringing that humanity to this role, like his humanity.
I remember when I first read the script. Actually, I was, I think Sitting Bull appeared, page 20, and the first thing he says made me laugh, and right away I knew immediately that I think Stephen Knight had figured something out. We have survivalist humor, in every community, every Indigenous community I've ever visited. Within minutes of meeting each other, we're laughing, we're teasing each other, and so there's this beautiful wit that kind of works its way through all our interactions, and it's absent from almost all depictions of us.
Yeah,
and it was apparent, in that first scene. And then again and again and again. And I always look at humor as, that's just intelligence, that's awareness.
Yeah. I mean, you came in and we started joking around right away about Drake and about, we did,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what was in the script. That's what spoke to me from the page immediately. And I knew, I had to do this part.
How did you find shooting the film? Any moments on set stick out in your mind?
The beauty of New Mexico.
Yeah.
And also, really finding partners, really finding allies. Susanna White, Jessica Chastain, these are friends now. These are people I have learned to trust and love. Because in my experience in the industry, Native actors, we are always we're agitating. We are working from inside a system to expand it,
right?
To bring it towards our subjectivity. And so I've often found myself just fighting battles alone, or with the other Indigenous actors. And all of a sudden with this project, I'd begin, and then all of a sudden, Jessica or Susanna would say, no, he's more sophisticated. I think he should have this. And all of a sudden, I wasn't alone fighting these battles.
You mentioned allyship there. It's an interesting topic to bring up because this film is two very different characters. So again, a wealthy white woman from Brooklyn, played by Jessica Chastain, as you said, and Sitting Bull, the Indigenous leader that you play. They seem to find common ground. I don't want to give away too much from the film, but is there a message for us in 2018 in the film?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We know that Sitting Bull was extraordinarily distrustful of settlers and their agenda. But when he made friends, these were deep friendships. Like Buffalo Bill was one of his close friends. I know that there was a RCMP commander in Saskatchewan when Sitting Bull brought his people up to Canada to escape the cavalry, that they became, he learned to trust him. And Catherine Weldon was also one of the people that he learned to trust. She became a confidant, an ally. And to me, I can't think of a more appropriate kind of message in a time where our discourse is so angry, so distrustful, that there is literally no common ground. It's one or the other. And these two people from extremely different backgrounds, from different points of view, learn to trust each other. And ultimately, it's a story about their friendship. And it's unique. I've not read anything like it.
I want to go back to something you were saying earlier, Michael Greyeyes, in this new film, Woman Walks Ahead. You said, I didn't necessarily see the complexity in roles involving Indigenous people in the past of my career. I want to go, I definitely know the answer to this, I think, but when you were a kid, did you see any roles like this? How complex were roles back then?
Rare. Completely rare. Because very often, like I knew what our experience was. Like I knew what it was like to be a Native kid, an Indian kid in Saskatchewan growing up around my family and my cousins and aunts and uncles. And then I'd look at our images, we had 2 channels.
Where in Saskatchewan?
Saskatoon.
Right.
And I'd look at our 2 channels, and if there was ever something, like usually a Western, and there was a depiction of us, it was profoundly disconnected from my own experience. So I kind of was like, what's that about? And then, as I was older, I started to see different kinds of depictions, something more nuanced. I remember Will Sampson. I remember when I first saw him in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It was arresting. I think I was maybe 12 or something when I saw it. And then Chief Dan George. So there were few instances, but they were like earth-shaking, because all of a sudden I saw ourselves, our faces, our truths in front of me finally.
So have you come to terms with, or I know this is one of those things that you probably only think about, or only people like me think about necessarily, because I don't think actors think about their careers like this, but there are going to be young Indigenous kids, there are going to be young kids looking at you in that same way. Has that occurred to you in this film?
I think about it. I was just actually in Oklahoma, and it was a predominantly Indigenous audience that came to see it in Tulsa. And their reactions were it was incredible.
Yeah.
It was incredible because, first of all, we don't see our 3-dimensionality. Even when films have content about us, something is missing. And I know that, there's been a lot of discussion, just recently about how do we address that? How do we address representation? How do we make it work for us? How do we make it more truthful? And so when they responded like that, I realized, we've got a long way to go.
What kind of conversations were you having with people? I'm sure you were talking to some of the folks who went to see the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So afterwards, I just hung out and talked to people.
Yeah.
And these are people from what was called Indian Territory. So it was part of the Indian removal. And so these were Creek people, originally from Georgia that had been displaced and dispossessed of their land, and they came to Oklahoma, and then they created new communities. And so they said, I may not be as aware of that history,
right,
of Lakota history, as I am of my own, Osage, whatever. And they said, but it is our story. It's our story, and thank you for reminding me of that history.
I want to bring up something before we let you go. The film was shot in New Mexico, as you mentioned, but it's set in Sitting Bull's people's traditional homelands in Standing Rock in North Dakota. There were huge anti-pipeline protests taking place during the time you were actually making this film. What was it like reading these headlines in the morning while you were telling the story?
It galvanized us. Period films are beautiful.
Yeah.
They can be really profound statements about our today, right? And there they were. The water protectors were to the north of us. Water cannons, people. This angry face of America. Just pitted against this group of people saying, "Hey, just stop this." And then we'd go to work and we'd, put on our costumes of, buggies, horses, cabins.
What a change.
Yeah, it was radically different, but the battle was the same.
What do you mean?
The state wants land, manifest destiny. They want the land, they want the resources, but there's always been a problem. The problem is the indigenous population that lives on it. So they've cleared us through violence or starvation. And we were watching it play out in the press. And then there we were enacting a drama from, some 100+ years ago that was essentially the same narrative. Different people.
I can't imagine.
Same story.
So you must have been having these conversations on set while it was happening.
Yeah, we'd talk about it. And it reminded us that our work, it's a period film, of course, but it was relevant and sadly relevant.
I was gonna ask you about a takeaway when you watch this film, A Woman Walks Ahead. I think I might know the answer, but what do you think it is? What kind of conversations do you want audiences to be having as they're leaving the theater?
It's a love story at its heart. It's about people learning to trust each other. And for me, I'm a fan of film. It's a new take on the Western entirely. And its treatment of violence in particular, it haunts me, because the Western is bathed in blood, often Indian blood. And this film treats it completely differently. Violence in this film is unexpected, aberrant, grotesque. And it reminds us actually to look at our lives, our current landscape, and analyze the violence in it differently.
Michael, it's such a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming in.
A real pleasure.